Okay, why does my lawn have a dark green ring? This is a fairly common one. It's not real common, but it's pretty easy answer. Fairy ring is right from the Panhandle. Panhandle, you're just right on top of everything because you want to go home. I am trying to speed things up. I only gave you 10 minutes for the break, or 20 minutes instead of 30 minutes for the hands-on thing. We skipped the break, and I was trying to wrap up at 1/4 so there'd be time for questions. So I think we're going to get done here and easily by 8:30, if not before. So I hope that helps you out west. This is fairy ring. Fairy ring is, it's a fungus, but it's a mushroom fungus. And if you look really closely, not always, but sometimes you'll see the fruiting bodies, which are the actual mushrooms growing in this ring. But you'll often not ever see the fruiting bodies themselves unless it's kind of a wet year or the homeowner overwaters their lawn. They believe the dark ring is actually caused by, the mycelium of the fungus or the fungus itself actually decomposing and creating nitrogen. And so that's why you kind of get that darker ring from the compost. And it can get bad. It can get so dense that sometimes this can actually die out where that ring is. It can actually die out. It doesn't happen often, but it can, and they believe that's because that mycelium of that fungus gets so dense and so thick that it just actually does not it repels water. And there really is no fungicide spray for this. The only thing I've ever heard, they sometimes say if you power rake the area, especially if there's more than one ring in a lawn, that if you go in there and power rake, that for some reason, if you mix those fungi up, they kind of antagonize each other or something. And some people have done that and it's gone away. But maybe it's just a matter of removing excess thatch that the fungus is actually attracted to or growing to in the same case. But this is a fairy ring. You'll sometimes see mushrooms in it. You can apply a fungicide, cannot apply a fungicide to control it. Okay, my pine tree trunk is full of holes and the needles have this white stuff on them. What is it? Okay, to speed things along. Well, the holes, it's two separate issues. They're not connected. It's possible, pine bark beetle and scale. Good job. The holes in the pine tree itself, there's a number of beetles. If you're out west, it could be mountain pine beetle. If you're in the east, it could be Ips pine beetle, more likely. But there's a number of pine bark beetles out there. And the Nebraska Forest Service website, they have an excellent small publication on the different pine beetles in Nebraska. So that's a good source to go to. Usually it's like any borer, once it's in the tree and it's brittled to this point. If the tree is really, really healthy, chances are it isn't, which is why those beetles are in there to begin with. But the trees can live a long time with this. And there are sprays. There are insecticide sprays at certain times of the year if the homeowner wants to, that you can spray on the tree. And it might help. But with any borer, especially at this point where you have this much damage, it doesn't always help as much, or they're just difficult to control. So, but if they don't have the pine bark beetle, and they can help the tree to live as long as possible by controlling the scale. This is pine needle scale. And with scales, you can always take your thumb and you can kind of flick those little white spots off. Any kind of scale. If it's oyster shell scale on lilacs, they're kind of bronze colored, but you can still flick the scales off. And that's how you know it's a scale insect and not a natural part of the plant. In this case, it's obvious it's not a natural part of the plant, but there's a little insect underneath there and it's feeding on the sap of the needles. This is pretty heavy. If a large part of the pine tree is this heavily infested with pine needle scale, it's going to cause some stress for that plant and potentially some dieback. So, excuse me. The problem with scales is once they're at this stage, they have that waxy white covering over them, protecting them. And so it's pretty difficult to control them at this stage. Almost all scales, you want to control them in the crawler stage. So you have to know, again, this is where that knowledge is a tool. You have to know what time of the year they hatch, the eggs hatch. The majority of them in Nebraska, they overwinter as eggs underneath that scale, and they hatch in the spring. And so you want to be doing that white paper test or something like that, and when the crawlers are present, that is when you would apply an insecticide to control scale insects. Now, on a lot of pine trees, I might see a few of these scales scattered here and there on the tree, and in a case like that, I'll often tell the homeowner to just watch the plant, and if it never gets any worse than that, don't attempt to apply an insecticide. I think the thinking is if I don't spray something and I don't control it now, the population is going to explode and get out of hand. But it's fine, again, that's where knowledge is the tool, depending on the insect, but with many of them, it's fine to watch it for a while. The population is low to begin with, because a lot of times there's natural things and beneficial things like parasites that will come in and control it for you. But it bears monitoring and watching. And Norfolk is saying acephate is a systemic. You're right, the systemic, and thanks, it's probably Wayne out there. And systemics can control when they're underneath that waxy scale, if you do use a systemic insecticide. And again, if a pine tree, especially a younger pine tree, every needle was this heavily infested, I would consider control. But if it's just a few here and there on the plant, I think it would warrant watching. And it's not an edible. Remember with the raspberry, I said that's an edible plant, so we're usually not using systemics, and very few are registered for those. But this is a pine tree, so the systemics are registered. Thanks, Norfolk. Wayne, if that's you, thank you. What is this? Should I remove it and destroy it? Wasp nest or gall, praying mantis offica. Okay, I'll have to ask on if cutting a section out of the trunk of what to control what. You might type from Kime Hall if you want to, and John, which question are we referring to? But the rest of you, yes, this is a praying mantis sac. Okay, and it's nothing that needs controlling. It doesn't even need to be destroyed. It's a praying mantis egg sac. And this was a fun picture I took. I came to work one morning, and this was what greeted me on the side of the courthouse building. It's a Chinese mantid, the great big one, with a Carolina mantid on its back. And it's kind of comical because Chinese mantid will eat the Carolina mantid. And so this Carolina mantid, I guess, was pretty smart that day. Figured out a way not to get eaten by this Carolina mantid. This was just one of those fun pictures, and I just decided to throw it in. Okay, the pine tree. Well, cutting out a chunk of a trunk is never a good thing. I think that was the question, is asking if cutting a section out of the trunk is a good means of control. And you're talking about the pine bark beetles. No, that will not control. That will only cause damage to the trunk, and if the tree is stressed for some other reason, and that's why the pine bark beetles are in there to begin with, it won't seal off that wound, and you probably end up getting decay down the road in there. So. Unrelated, but is there a neb guide on how to plant a mat? A mat of what? Sorry. different from what we have seen? I get Panhandle, I don't know what's different from what you've seen. Thanks on the nice picture. I was forced to type that the Lincoln crowd is not serious at all. Tim, you just shouldn't listen to them. They're being ornery. Okay, I think I'm already up to my last question. Why are my tree leaves turning brown? Webworms is one answer. And I don't know if that Buffalo is saying as recently shown on Saturday's Backyard Farmer. If you're talking about my Carolina mantid and Chinese mantid question, I shared that picture with Jim Kalish because I knew he'd enjoy it. So if he's using it and showing it, that's great. I told him to use it however he wanted to. And if you're not talking about that picture, then let me know what you're talking about. Okay, I'm only getting webworms. Wayne is holding back. Okay. This is actually bagworm on a shade tree. I still don't know what you mean by a mat being planted. I'm sorry. But back to question number 20. This is bagworm on a shade tree. And this is what bagworms look like when they're about a ½ inch here. They're even tinier than that. Now bagworms are, again, there's a little insect inside there and it's just taking leaf tissue and it's creating a little nest for itself. And it moves around on the plant and it feeds. You can kind of see the leaves. We call it skeletonizing because when they were smaller, they're just going to scrape that green leafy tissue off of there. Okay. And as they get bigger, then they're starting to chomp on the edge of the leaf. Okay, but we don't worry. This is another one. Bagworm can be a very serious issue on our evergreens. Okay, so with bagworms, control is recommended on evergreens. It is definitely recommended on our evergreens. And we usually recommend spraying after the eggs hatch. They overwinter. All of a sudden I went blank, Wayne. I think the overwinter is eggs inside of that sac. I was thinking it was maybe the overwintered as the pregnant female. If I'm wrong, Wayne, remind me. From one year to the next year, I'm getting old enough, I forget those exact details. Anyway, when they hatch out, late May, early June is when they hatch out. And when they're really tiny, Bacillus thuringiensis is an organic control that homeowners can use on our evergreens. And we actually don't recommend control on our broadleaf trees. If a homeowner really, really wants to, you can, again, it'd be the same recommendation. When they're really tiny, early in the season, maybe an 1/8 to a 1/4 of an inch to ½ inch long, that might be stretching it, but that Bacillus thuringiensis works very well. Otherwise, as they get older and they're starting to mature and chew and feed, then we need to use some of the other insecticides, carbaryl, acephate, pyrethrins will work as well. The thing with on evergreens with bagworms is once they stop feeding sometime in August, insecticides are not going to work. And then this time of the year, if you have them, you just pick them off and discard them. But they can be pretty loaded. The plant can be pretty loaded, and that will help. It'll reduce the population, but it isn't always 100% control. Yeah, I thought it was the eggs inside of the female bags. So the small caterpillars can spread by ballooning, and that is how they balloon. When they first hatch in the spring, they actually create a little web and they kind of balloon out, and that's how they will blow on the wind from tree to tree, and that's how they spread, even though they're so tiny. And these things are tiny. I had somebody bring in a sample, and I couldn't even see the bagworms or find the bagworm, but I set the sample down on my desk. And I have a white pad there. I picked it up and turned around. I was going to look under the microscope. I turned back, and these little brown triangles were walking around moving around on the mat on my desk. And I went, oh, you have bagworms. But they were pretty tiny at that stage. So that is my last. That was my last one. Again, we got done almost a half an hour early, in part because I didn't use as much time for the hands-on activity. I didn't give you a break. And I kind of sped through these last questions. I was going to have you take time to discuss each one and chat more answers, but I can appreciate your concern with the weather out west. Any questions for me? Okay, the app, there probably is an app for that. I know that there's a lot of plant ID apps where you can take a picture of the plant itself, and it will, it will automatically give you a bunch of suggestions of what they think this plant is. With all the apps out there today, I can't imagine that there aren't some plant, disease, insect. Yeah, I have not looked for them myself. If anybody is aware of any, let us know. They'd have to be pretty specific to a location, because what we find even in eastern Nebraska is different than what we often find in western Nebraska. So that's the problem there. And on the plant diagnostic guide, you can just order that from marketplace.unl.edu. There's a lot of color to that. So it is, I don't remember the expense, the cost of it. If somebody remembers, type it in there. It's available on marketplace.unl.edu, or as Master Gardeners, you could ask your local extension office if they would be willing to order that for you. I offer it to my Master Gardeners, and anybody that wants to pay for it, purchase it and pay for it. We go ahead and order 2, 3 at the beginning of the year, if that's how many people want it, and then they just pay me for it. Okay, tomato fruit has bottom rot. If somebody's asking what's causing that, it's most likely blossom end rot. If that's why, Frontier County, if that's why you're asking, is that actually a question? I assume it's actually a question. When tomatoes rot on the bottom, kind of a leathery rot, kind of brownish, it's usually blossom end rots, and some varieties are more likely, it's not a disease, not an insect, it's physiological. Some varieties are more likely to get it than others. Usually it's those first few early fruits. The actual cause is a lack of calcium in the fruit, but there's usually plenty of calcium in the soil. It's just that the leaves, especially if the leaves are growing very succulently, there's been a lot of irrigation, a lot of rain, maybe excess nitrogen, and the leaves are using the calcium and not enough is getting to the fruit. But with most varieties of tomatoes, it seems like they kind of adjust, and then the later fruit are not affected by blossom end rot. Thanks for the beautiful garden. I'll tell my mom that, she's here. Is there any control for the thrips on the onions? Yes, there is a control. They're difficult to control, but you need to start very early in the season when the onions are young, because what they do is they tend to get down into that whorl. And once they're down and hiding down inside that whorl of that plant, they're a little bit more difficult to control. But there are insecticides labeled for use on onion thrips. They have to be labeled for use on vegetables and say that they will control the onions. Whoops, sorry. I was trying to scroll through the chat. Mat of growing medium with small seedlings planted within the mat. I know there's a lot of, there's a lot of different, I'm back to that question about the mat and planting the mat. And I know there's a lot of things like that that are available on the market anymore, where you just buy the mat and you lay down the mat and it already comes, with the seed embedded in it, and you start watering it. I've seen them for wildflowers, and I'm guessing there's probably additional ones out there.